This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This week, a couple of interviews from my time in Portland in early August. First, we'll hear from Lacy Davis and Jim Kettner, a married couple putting out their first graphic novel, Ink in Water, which was released on October 1st. It's Lacy's story of her struggles with anorexia, illustrated by Jim. I asked them about the process of making the book, the challenges of collaborating with your spouse, and the nature of eating disorders, which have both physical and mental effects. And then my talk with Charles Brownstein, Executive Director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is based in Portland. We talked about the organization's mission and how it came to be based in Portland. What have been its biggest victories and defeats? What's the difference between censorship by the government or by private companies? And the difference between comics that show kids in sexual situations versus actual child pornography. We also talked about the Comics Code. Were comics ever really just for kids? Lacy and Jim in a moment. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. Okay, I'm talking with Lacy Davis and Jim Kettner. How are you guys?
We're great.
Great.
Yeah, I don't even remember now how we ended up doing this. I asked somebody. Yeah, the phone. That happens all the time. Oh, I think it might have been Matt Sillidy suggested you guys. That was how it was. Yeah, he gave me several suggestions. Yeah, so I just, there it is on your table, Ink in Water, the book that just, is it out now? Or?
No, this is one of our preview copies. This is an advanced reader copy that they've been sending us these different iterations of the book. I think that it's finally finalized and it's off to the press. It comes out in October, but these were just the sort of dummy copies that were our last chances to change anything, and we took them.
Yeah, we did. We took those chances, yes.
Yeah, the PDF you showed me had what was said like it was a correction copy, or I can't remember what the words were on every page that I saw, but yeah, I didn't really see much I didn't see like many typos or anything, but maybe you guys caught something.
I didn't see typos. I had like things that I decided I wanted to change, like there's one thing in the book, there are some mentions of like it's a book about eating disorder recovery, which might be useful for your listeners to know. Yeah. And on some pages there were mentions of numbers, and I just decided that I would rather have the memoir be devoid of numbers, like I'm talking weights or calorie counts or anything like that, just because I think eating disorders can be so competitive and insidious that I didn't want anything in the book to come off as like a tip or something. So I like woke up one day and was like, I have to change those numbers. They have to be X'd out, and we did. So yeah. that was good. And little things like that where it wasn't like a typo so much as it would be like a slight content adjustment.
Or issues of layout. One thing for this book, this is our first full-length graphic novel. And it's from a publisher who's their first time publishing a graphic novel. And so there's a lot of growing pains in terms of that process of...
Who's the publisher?
It's New Harbinger Publications. Okay. They're out of Berkeley, California. Yeah, they mostly work in self-help.
It's like a mental health imprint, and it's small.
Yeah. So just that sort of process of, we know comics, but we've never worked on a very large one before. This is the longest work that we've ever done together or separately, and
True.
And also New Harbinger kind of had to learn a little bit about laying that stuff out. And so there were things when we got the first print, like this first copy, it was like, oh man, there's layout issues, things have to be moved, and so just that sort of technical side. So we had a couple of last minute scrambles, but all in all, like so we had probably had a pretty stressful like last 2 weeks of just like crossing every T and dotting every I, and now we're like
now we're dead.
Now we're dead.
Now we're ghosts.
Now we're ghosts, and we can talk to you all about it. But the pain of doing it is over. Now we get to just be excited about it coming out this fall.
Okay, yeah, my first ever interview with ghosts. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Okay, so yeah, this is Lacy's memoir.
Yep.
Now, had you ever done any comics work at
No.
all?
No. I've read a lot of graphic novels, but I had not.
And you have not been an artist or anything?
I am an artist. I went to art school. I actually have a master's of fine art, but I did like video art. So I can't draw at all. In fact,
yeah, I guess there's some of that in the book. You're showing stuff in the gallery.
Exactly. So how we did the book was I did draw it, but in like weird stick figures and blobs in a notebook, and then Ket took it and made it into something that actually was A, legible to a person that is not him or I, because my handwriting is not good, and B, actually had like nice drawings instead of stick figures.
Yeah, it was really collaborative in the way that we worked it out, because like Lacy's writing background is like she's a very excellent like sort of essay writer and blogger. It's true, and that was your writing background. And so in early versions of the project, right when we got it, Lacy would sort of hand me an essay, and I'd be like, "Hey, this is great. This is really good narration. It's going to take so long to translate this into comics." And so, as you said, like our contact is through Matt Sility. I also teach comics. I'm going to be teaching with the MFA in Comics program starting this fall, actually. And I sort of went back to Lacy and I was like, "Okay, you got to use stick figures." And so we had this notebook. I almost wanted to get out of the office and grab it, but there's a spiral bound notebook. And so Lacy would do it, and I would be, even if you can't draw it fully, even if you just have to write what the picture is, just break it down just to get a sense of how much story fits on a page, and then I will adapt it.
Right, and every page I wrote was like a 12-panel page at first, and Ket would be like, no, like, this is like 4 pages, like, you have to think more visually.
Right.
And I just, like I said, I've read graphic novels, but I haven't written them, so I just wasn't thinking about pacing in the same way. I was trying to cram as much in as possible. Yeah.
And then the other thing that I would say that really changed a lot would be, I thought Lacy's narration was super strong, and one of the big edits that I would be, so in a lot of ways I was sort of like an editor, and I'd be like, you know what? You're telling all of this in narration. This needs to be a scene with characters talking. Right?
Yeah,
and
show, don't tell.
Right. And so it would be like, well, who would be a good person for this scene? Like, and sometimes I would write in like rough dialogue, and I would do a draft, and then I was doing it all digitally, and then I would show it back to Lacy, and Lacy would be like, "Oh, I like this. Change this. Oh, that character wouldn't be saying that way." And so there was
a lot of that of like, that character wouldn't be like that.
Right. So there was a lot of this, literally almost like passing a book back and forth to each other, ongoing throughout the whole process. And I think that's one of the book's strengths. Honestly, I think it was really fun that we were very intimately involved in both sides of the process.
So, Jim, what's your art background?
I have a bachelor's degree in illustration from the School of Visual Arts from like the turn of the century, and I did like nothing with that for about a decade. And I didn't really start making comics until 2010. I sort of had like a long break where I just like, moved around the East Coast mostly and worked crappy jobs and went to punk shows. And in 2010, I started doing web comics. My buddy Liz Prince, I'm wearing her T-shirt right now. But she had started doing web comics on a website called If You Make It, and that was like a punk rock indie music website. They wanted to do a comics page. And my background prior to this, the stuff I was doing in art school was science fiction, very like Humanoids Press, Inky Bilal, epic, bit off way more than I could chew kind of projects in my early artistic career, right? And so Liz is like, yeah, do you want to do, some memoir comics, like 2 pages for a website? And I love, memoir comics and indie comics, but I wasn't used to drawing myself or situations like that. And so I started doing these comics for If You Make It, and that's actually what ended up building momentum and getting me more gigs, and that led to doing some stories for the As You Were anthology that's from Silver Sprocket Bicycle Club. And yeah, sort of took off from there.
Okay, but you had never done a full graphic novel like this before.
I had done.
The answer is no. You like almost did, but then didn't.
I did. I've done some other like freelance freelance stuff. I actually did.
Oh, yeah.
I was gonna say, I was like, hey, I know my CV.
Oh,
I actually,
it's not okay.
I did.
I'm sorry.
It's a graphic novel I don't talk about very much, but I actually did about a 70-page. I did a 70-page comic for a band called the Chronicles of Sound, and they were like a Philly band. And I lived in Philly for a long time. They had seen my stuff in like local art shows, and like, hey, they were like I don't think they're active anymore, but they were like a cosplay kind of band, and they were like, oh, each of us have a character that we play on stage. Would you be into that? And I was like, hey, sure. I just got into grad school, and so you asked about my background. I then, in 2011, I moved to the West Coast from Philly, and I got my MFA in writing from the California College of the Arts, and that's where I met Matt Sility. But during that time, I was also drawing the 70-page comic when I wasn't getting my MFA, so that was a gig. But like, no, not a lot of eyeballs have seen that comic. This is the first one of
our content.
This is the first one that we are creatively behind. You know, all of my other stories tend to be under 10 pages for anthologies or for the web. Mm-hmm. Did a couple-page story for SF Weekly a couple years ago. Done some stuff for Razor Cake magazine. You know, so just sort of a scattering of credits, but all pretty short. And this for me, this is like a big deal. This is what I've always wanted to do.
I was interested in your technique. So this is an all black and white comic, and I guess, are these based on photos somehow, these backgrounds, or how did you do these backgrounds?
Sure. Well, I did the whole book in Clip Studio Paint, and I sort of made the switch to going fully digital right when we got the book deal, because I realized that hand lettering I was never going to hit deadline, that I was going to have to speed up my process and actually just streamline it. And as a process of going digital, a lot of the stuff you see with the backgrounds end up being, you know, more in line with like a cell animation style, where the foreground characters are always on a different layer, and for a lot of the times, you know, I would pull up reference photos, I would use Google Maps, I would just spend part of my days, if there was a page I was drawing, I would spend like maybe like an hour pulling up photos that I would use as reference that I could just refer to on my Cintiq as I was drawing, and sort of paint in the backgrounds. And you can sort of see my learning curve through the book, you know, from the early pages to the later pages, in terms of, I think, like how that process how well it was integrated. But yeah, for me that was really fun, and I think that, you know, working in black and white and gray tones was a good fit for this subject matter.
Yeah, well, and then, the title is Ink and Water, and there are a couple of places, if you read the whole book, in the latter part of the book, a couple of times that phrase is in the narration, but also I felt like that title fit the art style well, and especially how kind of in the places where Lacy is especially battling kind of her demons, there are like a lot of ink splotches that I thought really worked well for those scenes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a question there, but just a comment.
Just a compliment is cool.
Well, that came really early on, and I feel like it was something that was in some of the early pages, probably even during that essay stage where you described the seed of an idea in terms of the ED, and then I was like, how am I going to visualize that in terms of this? It's something I would think of this girl's story. I would think of, you know, even though we are married and we see each other every day, I had to like put myself head in it's like, okay, this is Lacy and she's like 19, you know, like how does that fit? And so I just thought of it almost as like this cancer, this just like ink splotch like floating in your head, that just can spill out and grow and sort of get out of control, because I feel like that's the experience not just of ED but other people who have different mental loops.
Yeah, and then later on, those kind of ink splotch sort of evolve into these sort of muddy-looking word balloons that have the phrases that are coming into Lacy's head, like about needing to stay thin or whatever. I thought that was really interesting. And that's not just splotches of ink, but it's really kind of artistically rendered, I don't know, mud balls or something.
They're almost like Kirby bubbles, but way more depressing. Oh, gosh.
So, now I was talking with somebody else in one of these many interviews I've done that have all kind of blurred together now about how it can be sometimes risky to work on a project with someone you're close to, you know, a close friend or a significant other. How was that for you guys? I mean, sometimes it ends relationships, so apparently it didn't in this case.
We're going to stay together. I still want to be married to you.
Yeah, let's do that.
High five to that. I honestly found it very challenging. Like, you know, if most of the pages had 6 panels, let's say, and there's 270 pages in the book, there's just a lot of opportunity to argue. And it's a sensitive subject matter, and representing people, some people that aren't alive anymore, or some people that are alive, but I like still want them to be represented in a way that feels fair and honest. And they're people that Ket doesn't know. So there was a lot of like, you know, sometimes you want to bend a story you want to bend an occurrence to make a better story. But I felt very attached in some instances to people being how they are. Right.
Yeah, that's probably a very common conflict. I would think of them as characters, and Lacy, and if you've read the book, you know that eventually we're both in the story at the same time. So there's events that, I know these people, I know the situations, but the stuff before then, I would be like, oh, well, that's a character.
Yeah.
And we can change it, you know, or bend it. And Lacy would be like, no, we can't change it.
We cannot change or bend it.
Right. No, yeah.
And some things did, you know, like, as I went through the process, I realized that you actually shouldn't always portray things exactly how they are because it's too long. Like, more or less, like, you just have to cut some things out to make a streamlined story, and sometimes you have to combine characters into one person. But that was, like, kind of a point of contention. I think, as I'm a person that definitely cannot draw, I think watching Ket take my super crappy stick figures and turn them into something that was, in my opinion, so beautiful was really gratifying for me. And also he knows me really well. So I might, in the script, there might be something, or in the final version, there might be something that I would definitely do, or a face I would definitely make, or a thing I would definitely say, but I didn't have that in my script. And because he knows me so well, he's able to kind of pick those things out where they would be appropriate. And I'm like, I probably would have said that. I didn't think of it, but yeah, that's actually probably more correct than what I had written initially.
Lacy's a character that I felt pretty comfortable writing. You know, so a lot of the times it would almost be like I use like Lacy's captions and I would write dialogue, and it would be like, yep, that's exactly what you would say. Like, and feel confident, pretty confident. You didn't fight me too much if it was anything about you. But we talk about our collaboration a lot as it ended. I think that we probably fought over certain parts about the book, but
we definitely fought.
Yeah, we definitely fought about certain parts of the book, but it's great. You know, we got through it. And at first, I think we were like this. We were just tired when the draft was done, before this sort of last minute editorializing, and we probably took about a month of just like, okay, we don't have to really do this every day anymore, where it's not coming up. And then after about a month, we were already our gears started turning about, well, what do you want to do next? You know? So it definitely didn't like end a creative relationship. I mean, I feel like we're both pretty excited about it. We're excited to make comics together.
Yeah, we have like a new project already in the works, and actually one new book project that we're kind of talking about, and one digital project already in the works that's launching next Tuesday. And, you know, it would be easier if we didn't work on creative projects together, but I think it would be less gratifying.
Yeah, so you were talking a little bit about incorporating other real people into the story. Now, that came up in your discussions together, but in terms of the other people and were there like discussions about those people's feelings, or are people complaining? I guess the book's not out yet. Maybe they haven't seen it, but
yeah, it's not out yet.
Approach that.
I think there's. We didn't ask anyone. I asked one person if I could use her name. I think that people's names have been changed. Defining characteristics have been changed. If anyone knows me from that time in my life, they might know who those people are, but it's not super overt to like the public. Yeah, I mean, there's a possibility that one or two specific people might complain. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, like, enough was changed that for those, the sensitive case ones were definitely changed. On my end, I had a lot of fun with the Easter eggs, and a lot of my friends are just, like, in the background, because I'm just like, that's who was there at that time. And I almost thought of this graphic novel as a way of, like, just being faithful to that time in our lives. And that meant, like, oh, these people were there. And because a lot of these characters in the book, they don't even necessarily have lines. They're just sort of, like, in the background to get a sense of the flavor of who we were around. So it's really great to be like, oh, well, there's our friend Monica, and there's Cody, and you know, and they get to be around, and that's the coffee shop we went to all the time. And hey, Lacy's walking down the streets in San Francisco, and there's Borderland Books, and you know, like, oh, you're eating at Sunflower. We like got to give little shout outs to the places that are part of our lives, and that was really fun for me.
And those people won't complain.
They won't complain.
They will probably be psyched to see themselves.
Sure, those are just cameo appearances.
Right.
Totally.
But in terms of, like, characters, like, there's one...
the character of Henry.
Yeah, he might be mad, but when you act poorly and your behavior is represented in a book, like, it's hard to be like, well, that's what happened. Also, I feel like we both took a lot of pains with that particular character. We tried to make it very much like that person was flawed, and Lacy, as a character, was flawed too, and it's not like he's just a monster and he's bad. You know, like, I did try to be like, okay, like, some things weren't that awesome about the way that relationship ended, but, you know, also I was 19 years old and, you know, I was just as much of a screw-up as anyone else. So hopefully it's balanced enough so that it's not totally offensive. Also, his name has changed, so.
Okay. Yeah, well, that should keep him from getting too upset. So last night I looked at, there are dozens of them online, but like memoir writing do's and don'ts page. And I felt like your book pretty much followed the guidelines that were laid out on that page. Did you work with an editor on writing this, or how did you approach just the writing part of it?
I totally thought you were going to be like, you did all the don'ts, and I was going to be like, oh no.
I was like, oh my god, there's a list.
Yeah, we did have an editor, our publishers. Like, the first draft of the book was honestly terrible. I mean, not terrible, but it was like way weighted towards a part of the story that just really wasn't as consequential, and there was way less detail about another part of the story that really needed to be fleshed out.
Yeah, that was a don't. Yes.
Yeah.
And so, don't get it mixed up with an autobiography. It's a memoir that's about just that particular crisis point.
Exactly. So our editors at New Harbinger, it was challenging to hear feedback on this is a very personal, somewhat emotional story, but they helped shape the book and make it much better. And Ket too is a very brutal editor. So, I had my version, and Ket and I went back and forth with that version a lot, and it got better. And then I went to our editors, I think 2 or 3 times. Yeah,
the first, there was a bit of a kerfluffle in the editorial process, but when we got it straightened out in terms of the process by which we were going to edit it as a text, because our publisher, again, they were with the first graphic novel, they were really trying to approach the editing process much like a prose book, and we were like, that's not going to work.
Basically, they asked us to make changes after we inked the first few chapters, and we were like, absolutely not.
Right, so...
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. You must have been working out the writing before it got drawn, I would hope. Yeah.
Yes.
About 3/4 of it was fully written when I started drawing. I had by Christmas, New Year's of 2016, I think I had 180 pages loosely penciled. Yeah. So I had most of the book, and the book was originally only supposed to be 225 pages.
Yeah.
But then there was a period of time where they wanted sample chapters fully inked, so I switched gears from the thumbnail process to doing the finished art. So there was a kind of a slowdown with working out our process, but eventually when we had a 225-page draft and we gave them all the pencils and we're like, hey, read all of this and give us your full notes on that, that was probably last summer that we got that sort of feedback. And then it went through changes over last summer. And then by last fall is when we came to a final draft. Basically, a lot of the changes they wanted to make were more. Yeah. Less of this, but more of this, more of this, more of this. And we had to be like, well, if you want more of all that, it's not going to be 225 pages. Like, how big can this book be?
Yeah, we basically had to be like, what is the absolute maximum in this book? How long it can be? And they said 270, and it is 270 pages.
Yeah, we used every page they gave us. And it totally helped the book. Their structure notes were really good because it did condense a chunk in the middle, which, might as well say, it spent a lot more time dealing with Overeaters Anonymous in terms of, as a topic, and 12-stepping took up way more of a chunk of the book. And
they were like, make this 2 chapters instead of 4 or something.
Right, it was about 4.
So
yeah, and that was a great help, and it allowed us the room at the end to sort of fill out the sort of emotional beats and sort of bring it to, I think, a nicer place to leave off. And again, like you brought up a memoir, it's about an isolated period in a person's life. It's like, obviously, even though we said we're ghosts, we're still alive, we still have stories. But like, it's like, well, the book has to end. It can't just go on forever. So
yeah. And sometimes, we have a few reviews up on Goodreads because people have received advanced copies, and some people were like, I wish I saw more of this or more of this. And I'm like, there was no room. Sorry, random internet stranger. There was just no room to talk about my relationship with my mom or whatever.
Next book.
Yeah, totally.
So I found last night that now you're going to be, you are doing some coaching?
Yeah, I am a weight training coach, and I work specifically with, I don't do like weight loss type stuff, which seems simple, but is really different in the fitness industry. Like, I don't weigh and measure people. I don't talk about weight loss. We just talk about strengthening and empowering. And I work almost exclusively with queer people or transgender people or people that just don't feel comfortable in your average gym setting with your average trainer. And I am also opening a gym it's going to be open on September 2nd. Wow. So pretty soon. 1 month before the book comes out, which is sort of, that was not how it planned, but that's how it...
Everything's happening at once.
Yes. Yep.
That's the Lacy Davis way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like it necessarily, but it keeps happening in my life where I just have all these big things that happened around the same time, so it must be... I mean, it can't be an accident. It's happened like 5 times.
In the book, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Lots of things happening at once. Well, I mean, we didn't talk too much about the content of the book, but how would you sort of sum it up for somebody who hasn't read it?
Ink and Water is a memoir about my transition into an eating disorder, and from there my transition into recovery. I've pretty much always been feminist identified, so that is kind of different. I'm not necessarily the type of young girl that people would think would get an eating disorder. Also, I got it later in life. It started when I was about 24. So it kind of talks about how these sorts of things are cultural phenomenons that can happen pretty much at any time. And from there it talks about, the blanket topic is eating disorder recovery. It's also a love story between Ket and myself. It's also a memoir of a friend who struggled with addiction, and is also the story of how I got interested in weightlifting.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course I knew something about eating disorders already, but I was sort of struck reading this how it's sort of both a mental, emotional thing and a physical thing.
Totally.
Yeah, and where I don't know, I think it's changing, but traditionally we've sort of tended to separate those two fields, and they're really more interconnected. You can really see in this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of times people think of an eating disorder as a really specific type of body and how that body exists in the world, but eating disorders are categorized as mental illnesses, and they're also like the most deadly mental illness, literally statistically the most deadly mental illness that exists. And it is both a really internal thing that requires a lot of cyclical thinking and really reinforced externally from society's sort of validation of dieting and that sort of thing. So it's very complicated.
Yeah. Now, people who are busy making comics usually don't have any answer to this question, but have you read any interesting comics lately? Or have you been too busy?
I keep up with comics. I went to the comic book store today. I bought the new issue of Kill or Be Killed by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, which is a crime comic that I'm following, and it's probably my favorite comic on the stands right now. And I bought the first issue of the new Mr. Miracle comic, Tom King and Mitch Gerard's, which I read while I ate lunch, and that was my break in the day. It's sort of funny that when I was making the book, I was drawing comics 6 days a week. I was doing 6 pages a week, at least 6 pages a week, like straight for about a year and a half, like with that summer break where we were doing revisions. But Wednesdays is when I would not toward the end, but maybe for the first half of that process, I would be like, it's Wednesday. At lunchtime, I'm going to give myself a break, and I'm going to just like leave, and I'm going to like go downtown, and I'm going to buy comics, and I'm going to eat pizza, and I'm going to like just give myself a little mental health space, because as you can imagine, when you, especially with the subject matter, like sinking into a kind of like sad subject for a long time, it could be like, I was in that zone for a very long time myself, sort of drawing this book. But yeah, I keep up with comics. I love comics. There's less time for them, it seems like, as the years roll on and as I get busier. But I never want to completely quit. I love keeping up with it.
I just finished Fetch, which is a graphic novel written by my friend Nicole Georges. Just came out July 18th, and it is her memoir of her relationship with her very bad dog, Beja. And it was really good. I cried so much. So much.
I see. Is there any comic or anything else, anyone's work in comics or not, that you felt sort of influenced your approach to this book at all?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
For me, what really influenced my approach to this book is I've read a number of memoirs about eating disorders, and none of them are graphic novels, but they often do this thing where they go into the like extreme grotesque detail of the disorder in a way that almost glamorizes it. Like it makes it seem really like dangerous and kind of glamorous, and I just felt it was really important to write something that showed the truth without making it seem cool. Like that was my primary thing, which is why the very last thing I changed was the numbers thing, because I thought, like people who've struggled with food can have really strange minds around seeing these little things in representations of eating disorders that they can mimic almost without realizing they're trying to. So my main inspiration was just trying to make sure I could offer a different kind of recovery memoir.
I was really excited because one of my comics heroes, I feel like, gave us a blurb, and I mean several of my comics heroes and friends in the industry gave a blurb, but specifically Jessica Abel, who Lacy and I were lucky enough to work with at a residency at Atlantic Center for the Arts last fall, gave us a really awesome blurb, and I've been a fan of Jessica's work since the 90s, just like really influential. When I think of nonfiction comics, like her work was back to her early sort of reporting zines, like that was like sort of my window into nonfiction in the comics medium, and just her work ethic and sort of her organizational techniques were like a really big help getting through this book in the last year. And in terms of the art style, I don't know, like, I feel like my style has changed. I was always just thinking about trying to draw the way that things felt. And it led to some really different work. And if you see some of my older work, I feel like I grew with it. And it was, not to sound corny, but it was by being kind of like an emo cartoonist. But I was really trying to draw the feeling more than I was trying to draw something specific or about the structure of it. Yeah.
Okay. So, we got this book coming out in October. We got your gym opening in September. Jim, what else is coming up on your side?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mentioned briefly that I'm going to be teaching for CCA's MFA in Comics program for the fall for a mentored studio class. In the spring, I'm going to be teaching at the Oregon College of Arts and Crafts, and they're trying to get in the comics game, so they've just opened up a sort of narrative illustration program, so I'm going to be tackling a comics course for them. But the biggest thing, I guess, in terms of new creative work is that Lacy and I just launched a Patreon. We do a podcast together called Adult Crash that is all about sort of being in the punk rock scene and getting older, sort of like being, I mean, we're in our 30s, but we are very identified with this youth subculture and how that sort of changes for you as you mature. And we're talking to other people. We interview other people who are sort of in the same boat as us, and sort of how those ideals adapt into different careers and walks of life. And we listen to records and do stuff, but we also now are going to be doing comics.
Yeah, so it's the podcast comes out every 2 weeks, and our comics, we're going to release 8 to 12 pages of collaborative comics per month for supporters, and then people that support a little bit more will get a paper version of those comics. So that should take, I think, to have constantly new content. I think that'll be a good challenge for us.
Yeah,
that'll keep you busy.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm like, it's going to be great, and then I start to sweat.
like, oh no, what have I done?
No, it's awesome. I'm really excited. Like I said, we sort of took a breather after we finished work on Ink and Water, and then we're like, oh no, we've got this idea that we want to work on together, and this idea, and I feel like this webcomic Patreon is going to allow us to dabble and develop those different stories, and who knows where they might end up down the road. I mean, one of those stories might end up being the next graphic novel. But even if they just exist as webcomics, it's awesome. Yeah, we're stoked.
Lacy is on Twitter at Lacy J. Davis. Jim Kettner is on Twitter at XKettnerdX. That's XKettnerdX. Ink in Water, an illustrated memoir, or How I Kicked Anorexia's Ass and Embraced Body Positivity, by Lacy J. Davis and Jim Kettner, is now available. Buy it from deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon to help support this podcast. After interviewing Lacy and Jim at their home, I took a bus to Charles Brownstein's house. He's the executive director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. We sat on his porch and talked about the mission of the CBLDF and various cases where free speech in comics has been imperiled. That's coming up in just a moment. Thanks to our patrons, this past week I released the vintage episode 120 from March 24th, 2008, in which Brandon and I discuss Guy Delisle's Pyongyang, DVD movie Justice League: The New Frontier, and Writing for Comics with Peter David. I've posted links to it from Facebook and Patreon. Episode 119 has always been available on our site, but for the sake of completeness, I posted that link on Facebook and Patreon too. This coming week, episode 118, an interview with colorist Brian Miller. Watch for it at the end of your podcast feed, or on our Facebook page, or at patreon.com/deconcomics, where you can pledge a monthly amount to keep the show going and unlock more vintage episodes. We appreciate your support. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults, too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every first, third, and fifth Thursday of the month. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles.
Okay, now I'm talking with Charles Brownstein. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Tim?
All right. And you're, is this right, executive director of Comic Book Legal Defense Fund?
That's correct, yeah.
Right, okay. Well, how did you get this position?
I've been executive director of Comic Book Legal Defense Fund since 2002, and prior to coming to work at the fund, I was a reporter and event organizer within the comics business, and had happened to know Dennis Kitchen, who at the time was the president of the CBLDF, in my capacity as both, and when the opening came up, he asked me to try out for it. So, that's kind of the short answer. The more detailed, kind of interesting answer is that growing up, my real passions were comics and free speech. So, on one hand, doing a magazine called Feature with interviews with people like, Alan Moore and Will Eisner and others was like my grad education in comics. And on the other hand, my heroes were people like Lenny Bruce and George Carlin, who had really pushed the envelope in terms of free expression. So when the opportunity came up, the ability to take the background I developed in journalism and my short career there and my interest in comics and free expression all kind of merged into the perfect kind of position.
Okay, and this is a paid job?
It is, yeah.
Okay. How many paid positions do they have in CBLDF?
We have currently 3 full-time office staff and a contract editorial director that's working down in Alameda, Betsy Gomez. When I came into the fund, it was the full-time executive director and a part-timer. So in the 15 years I've been there, we've grown significantly.
Okay. And the organization's income comes from donations mainly?
That's right. Donations from individuals primarily. That's the largest base of it, as well as support from our corporate members, which is the majority of the comics publishing and book publishers of graphic novels, as well as items like Humble Bundle and various auctions and conventions throughout the year.
Okay. And what's the mission of the CBLDF?
The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund exists to protect the freedom to read comics. Our efforts since our establishment in 1986 have been to protect individuals facing First Amendment emergencies, protecting the First Amendment rights of retailers that find themselves being intimidated or prosecuted for selling comics, protecting artists who find themselves in similar situations or being targeted with fair use and other sorts of parody-oriented First Amendment emergencies, and increasingly protecting readers and librarians when comics are challenged in school and library environments.
Okay. Yeah, I was reading the FAQ on your site last night, and I was thinking about something that came up on the podcast a few years ago, and maybe it happens a lot, that I think there was a little bit of a misunderstanding of what your organization does. There have been some creators who do some like erotic comics where the problem is not with like the authorities, but with their outlet, like some outlets that sell ebooks, that somebody complains about this erotic comic and then just gets pulled from the shop. But is that not something that you would get involved with if it's like Google Play, for example, or something like that?
Sure. Definitely there's a concern about how private companies are transparent in the way that they allow the distribution of content. However, we acknowledge that they're private companies, and so it is the prerogative of Google Play. Apple has been a repeat offender, or any other private platform to determine how they're going to distribute their materials. We monitor this pretty closely because there are free speech implications, but it's not government censorship. It's not a prior restraint through the courts or through the exercise of law that impedes the First Amendment rights. So this is an area where we pay attention, we create education, we work with people behind the scenes when they have issues, but ultimately we recognize that it's the purview of these private companies to determine what exists in their ecosystem. What we advocate, though, is that there need to be transparent and evenly handed enforcement of their various guidelines in these areas. But that's more of an advocacy, and advocacy is a big part of what we do, bigger and bigger in the years that I've been there.
I see. Okay. I asked on our Facebook group for any questions I should ask you, and I got two, although one of them I'm not quite sure what the question was. But Kumar was wondering what have been the organization's most important wins and most disappointing losses.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I think that I'll start with the most disappointing loss was the case of Mike Diana, who was a American underground comic book artist in the 1990s who published a zine called Boiled Angel.
Okay. Yeah, actually, the other question was just to talk about him, so that you're answering both questions at once here.
Great. Mike is an interesting case. He, in some ways, was ahead of his time with his art. His art very closely resembles the stuff that you see on Adult Swim these days.
How long ago was this?
97.
Okay.
The William Street style of kind of grotesque, cartoony sensibility. And he had been pulled aside walking home as this long-haired, 20-year-old, miscreant-looking kid in Florida on the Christmas break by a cop that thought he resembled a murderer in a murder case they were looking for. And they brought him in, and they looked through his backpack and rifled through his comics, and ultimately decided, okay, well, you're not the suspect that we're looking for, let him go, and then came back later with a sting operation through the mail, attempting to get him to sell his comics to an undercover cop, and which he ultimately did, and then they hauled him in on obscenity charges. Now, the fund was pretty young at that time, and comics were a lot different at that time, too. So there was a lot of sensibility in the comics community of, well, surely free speech will prevail, even though everybody put a lot of distance between themselves and Mike's art, which was kind of descended from Rory Hayes and S. Clay Wilson in the American Underground. Real grotesque, sexually violent, sexually explicit, religious attacks, things of that nature. And so there was a lot of distance that people placed between the art and the principle of the First Amendment, but everybody thought for sure he would prevail in court. We brought in various experts to, working with the ACLU in Florida to testify on Mike's behalf, and ultimately the jury was persuaded that, art is Picasso. Art is what you would hang in a museum. This stuff's not art. And so Mike was convicted, and the terms of his sentence included that he could not draw in his own home. He was not allowed to, quote, create obscene material, and was subject to spot checks. And so that meant that a police officer or a probation officer could walk into his home at any time and see what he was drawing. He wasn't allowed within 200 feet of a minor, so he couldn't work at the 7-Eleven that he was working at. He had to take a journalistic ethics course at his own expense. So it was a real shocking loss that, even though all he was doing was making comics, all he was doing was making art, that the First Amendment didn't prevail. And in the times we're living in now, it's a really good example of how you can't take your rights for granted. There's a real pendulum here, and sometimes it swings so badly that you don't expect it, to be taking away some of the stuff that we take to be fundamental. So I think that's the worst loss, and that was back in 96, 97.
Okay.
The greatest successes, to me the best success are the cases that don't go to court. To me the best success is, earlier this year we had a couple of instances of cartoonists coming to us and saying, we got these, cease and desist notices, and they, want to shake us down for a bunch of money and make me stop doing my work. What do I do? And we are able to get our lawyers to take on the case, and they go away before they go to court. And those are the things that aren't sexy because you don't talk about them because they went away. But in terms of the stuff that did go to court, I think that the two on my watch that were most significant were Georgia versus Gordon Lee, and that was a case in 2004 through 2006 in Rome, Georgia, involving a retailer who was being prosecuted under the state's harmful to minors statute. Harmful to minors is a kind of variation on obscenity law that's state granted that says material that's constitutionally protected as to adults may not have the same level of protection as to minors. And it was going after a short story that was this magical realism story called The Salon, about the birth of Cubism, where Picasso is depicted in the nude. And the precedent in that case basically had to do with, can a retailer sell anything with mere nudity? Or is that de facto harmful to minors, even if it's non-sexual in its nature? We ultimately fought that case through various permutations that you can read about at cbldf.org, and won. And the most important piece of that win is that it was the last time, knock wood, that we've had to go to court to protect a retailer. I think it sent a really clear message that the comics industry has an organization that is vigilant in fighting for the rights of the field. And I don't think that that's been insignificant in stopping those kinds of cases. I also am pretty proud of the work that we did on Canada Customs versus Ryan Matheson. Ryan was a 26-year-old kid at the time who was abused by Canada Customs that pulled him aside because he had an anime screensaver and decided that the manga on his computer was child pornography. It was not. It was chibis. It was manga. But nonetheless, he was, unlawfully held for several days and brought up on charges of importing child pornography and allowed to go back home to Minnesota to await trial, but not allowed to use the internet outside of a specific company. So when that company cut his hours during the economic meltdown in 2008, he had no way to go back to school. He had no way to find other work, and it was all for comic book material. Now, Ryan, kind of courageously never took the plea bargain. He came to the fund when the case was underway and asked for our support, and we were able to provide that support in a way that helped both knock out the charges against him and, be the first case in North America that really pushed back on that trend of going after lawful anime and manga content.
Well, you bring up something that's come up before, this idea that drawings can be child pornography. I know other artists have gotten in trouble for those kinds of things where, a lot of people would argue, no, they're not real kids. No kids are actually being harmed here. Or some people might say even it still is, even if they aren't real kids. I don't know, where does your organization come down on that?
Well, I think that the law is making a false equivalency by attempting to prosecute expressive content as if it were actual behavior and conduct. And so if you're talking about comics, and you live in Tokyo, you see a whole diversity of sexually explicit content. Mm-hmm. That stuff lives within the realm of the imagination. That is not any kind of behavior that's harming a real person. And so we've worked on a variety of cases involving the protection of expressive content that might contain some sexually explicit fantasy material. And, there's kind of two things to say about that. One is, just because expressive content is icky doesn't make it against the law, and it certainly doesn't make it child pornography. Child pornography is photographic evidence of the physical abuse of a real person that did not give consent and cannot give consent. So to prosecute that expressive content in a way that equates it with the actual crime is really wasting law enforcement resources that could be going after real people hurting real people. So that's thing one. And thing two, back when we were working on these cases a lot, I had the opportunity to go to Tokyo and speak at the comic market. And I was very surprised to be there on the Women's Day, the first day. And I walked through these aisles and aisles of really sexually explicit content of the stripe of, children having sexual congress with grandpa. The kind of stuff that when I would see come over as doujinshi, I'd go, ew. But you know what? If somebody wants to look at it, fine. and the people that were making it were grannies.
Mm-hmm.
That's
mind-blowing. I've seen that too.
Yeah, so it's like, to a certain extent, comics are a form of role play. Comics are a form of imagination. And so why should the government have a compelling interest in cracking down on the subject matters of people's imaginative fantasies? What is the difference between an adult reading a comic that reflects the reality of these 60-year-old women making these comics where, they're illustrating their intersexual fantasy life, and somebody dressing up in a costume in the privacy of their own home? And why should that be the government's job? Mm-hmm. It's not black and white.
Yeah. Now, are all your kind of administrative functions out of Portland, or you have offices elsewhere?
No, we're a small organization. We have a single office here in Portland, so all of our admin runs out of here.
Okay. How did it end up in Portland? Just because it's a comics town, or?
Yeah, I mean, we were established in Wisconsin in '86 out of a room at Kitchen Sink Press, and when Kitchen Sink moved to Massachusetts, we moved there. I moved the organization to New York for a decade, and as the costs became unsustainable for a medium nonprofit there, we looked at other cities, and Portland had the best balance of being financially responsible for our donors' contributions and a community of comics and community of activism to plug into that work.
I see. So what's an average work day for you? What kind of things are you doing?
Well, average work day is a bit of a misnomer in any executive director job, but my time is really split between executing the program of the organization, so keeping watch on legal developments through our partnerships with organizations like the Media Coalition, keeping watch on challenges to comics and graphic novels, particularly working in partnership with the Kids Right to Read project, of which we're a sponsor, working with our lawyers on education programs. We're about to go on the road with a workshop designed to help retailers become acquainted with their rights better and train them how to deal with scenarios involving police visits and media attacks and things of that nature, as well as the really mundane things like, entering expenses and, going over the bank statements and, working with my fundraising staff, our great deputy director, Alex Cox, and our development manager, Georgia Nelson, on, kind of being the quarterback's coach, as they're working out the fundraising aspects. So there's no real kind of average day. That's kind of a day in the office, but I really only spend about a third of my time in the office, and then, a third of my time is on the road, either visiting conferences or lecturing at conventions or universities, and then the final third is spent, writing and working on program, materials.
Okay. And then we were talking before I started recording. Dan Kanemitsu has sort of represented you in Tokyo. Do you have representatives like that in other cities? Dan
Kanemitsu is really the most one of our most ardent and professional and great volunteers. He's kind of flying the flag for us in Tokyo in a way that's very unique. But we do have a body of volunteers throughout the United States that will support our work either in concert with our team when we go to a convention in their town or independently. But Dan's situation, speaking on our behalf in another country is very unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I'm sure he could tell you exactly what the freedom of speech laws are there. I don't know if it's exactly the same as America. I don't remember right off, but do you know off the top of your head?
It's pretty different. The last time I was out in Tokyo and working with Dan was when the Tokyo municipal government was attempting to crack down on explicit manga materials.
Right, yeah, we talked about that on the show.
And so I don't know how it's mutated, since then. I mean, back then the editors of Com magazine were arrested, and there was a real chill, that it descended upon Tokyo in a way that was crazy, because it was trying to make Tokyo more palatable to Western visitors, but not recognizing that the kind of content they were cracking down on would be constitutionally protected in the West. So it was just one of those lost in translation things of spending way too much time listening to, whatever group was targeting expressive content because they were getting funding from, whatever UN group, and deciding, okay, we're going to go too far in this direction. I don't know what the current state of affairs is there, but it was pretty chilling for a while.
Yeah. So you gave me this Comics Code seal pin. Now, let's see, the Comics Code sort of faded out when, like in the 2000s?
2011, it was shuttered.
Right. Okay. And that was because what the publisher just kind of decided they didn't need it anymore.
Well, the Comics Code was always a creature of the comic book business, right? So in 1954, when the moral panic against comics was so intense that there was concern about the potential for government regulation, the industry created the code as a way to guarantee distribution in a way that assuaged the concerns of the broader public and reduced the capacity for government intervention. It was revised in the 1970s when the social mores that the 1954 code were designed to address were not the same social mores. And so the Spider-Man drug issue went out, and there was no difficulty in distribution, so the code was able to amend itself. For instance, what's a swimsuit in 1954 versus what's a swimsuit in 1971? Very different concerns. So it was, at that point, revised in a way to reflect the industry at that time. As the industry became less dependent on the newsstand environment, where the seal of approval was something that mattered to certain news agents and certain parental groups, and became more a creature of the direct sales market, the code no longer was a requirement for distribution. So it eroded pretty steadily over time. And in 2001, Marvel pulled out of participating in the code in then Marvel publisher Bill Gemmis's very flamboyant way of saying, well, we don't need this stuff. This is a stupid throwback, and we're leaving the table as loudly as possible, which was fine. And so DC and Archie were kind of all that was left. And by the end of the first decade of this century, there really wasn't any further need for it. And so we got a call in early 2011 from Jay Kogan, who was at DC Comics in their legal department and overseeing the shutdown of the CMAA and the code, and said, this has been a symbol of censorship for almost 60 years. We would like to bequeath the code seal to the CBLDF so that you can use it to fight censorship from here on. So that's where you see things like this button that you can also find at cbldf.org, and occasional covers with it that raise money for our work, and are also a symbol of how moral panic, really changed an expressive field in the United States. I think that there's a really complicated set of associations in the code. Some of it is that warm feeling that some people might have because their first blush with comics, it was on every comic book, growing up. Other people will look at it and go, well, this put a third of the industry out of work in the 50s. It's a complicated symbol that I think is whose history is worth remembering, particularly as new moral panics produce themselves, which they do every time a new set of young people finds a new set of content.
Yeah, well, we talked about the book, The 10 Cent Panic, on the show some months ago, and I never quite realized before just how vilified a lot of comics creators became. They became afraid to tell people what they did for a living because they'd get scolded and whatever. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, David Haju's reporting on that book was great, and he has this great anecdote in there where Carmine Infantino, who was at the time an artist and went on to become the publisher of DC Comics in the 70s, said, you didn't go to a cocktail party and said that you made comic books. That was akin to saying you were a pornographer. Mm-hmm. There was a real powerful stigma against comics that really persisted until the start of this century.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in the 70s, I don't recall encountering that so much, but there was just almost an opposite feeling like comics are for kids.
Well, they were low-value speech. They were for kids and half-wits, and so it was fine if you were a kid, but if you were an adult reading this thing in public, people would look at you like, what's wrong with this guy? Mm-hmm. And that's, partially why I think you had all of those stories in the 1980s, bang, zoom, comics aren't for kids anymore, about, Watchmen and Mouse and things like that. Mm-hmm. But there was definitely, a pretty strong bias that this was not speech that is as valuable as film or traditional novels or, other kinds of more traditional forms of media. Mm-hmm. Is that your experience?
Well, yeah, for sure. Although my sort of hypothesis has been that was partly because of the Comics Code, because there were so many things you couldn't do in comics, while movies and TV went way beyond those same limits, and so the growth of American comics was really stunted for a long time, and so it became just, well, of course, with things like, I don't know, Dark Knight Returns, or Mouse wouldn't have really been subject to that because it was a book, but they proved that the medium could do things that would be interesting to adults rather than kids. But I mean, before the code, I guess the perception was still that comics were for kids, and so they shouldn't have this kind of content, or am I misunderstanding that?
You're not misunderstanding it, but it's, as most things, it's a little bit more nuanced. The great mystery of the 1954 Senate subcommittee hearings to me is that the industry largely conceded this notion that comic books were predominantly for children. Mm-hmm. When the historical sales data and the anecdotal data of things like letters columns illustrates that while children may have been a large segment of the reading population, there were sizable populations of adults that were reading it. Again, in Hayju's 10-Cent Plague and in Gerard Jones's Men of Tomorrow, there are statistics that a significant amount of the printed matter, something like 40% of the printed matter going to PXs in World War II, were comic books. That's being read by adult readers. Mm-hmm. It's being read by a lot of the same people that are reading comics right now, people in their late teens and early 20s. So there's things like that. If you look at the EC comics, which I've been studying the last couple years, they did these socially relevant, what we would now call social justice stories in shock suspense stories. And there was this one called In Memoriam, which happened to be published the same month that the armistice of the Korean War was signed. And it's about, it's Wallace Wood illustrating an Al Feldstein story about a young soldier who came back wounded, and he comes back to his small town, and the town has a big, welcome home hero. We're going to have a big victory parade for you. Go home, get some lunch with your family. We'll see you tonight. He goes home with his family and says, I want to visit Sam's grave. And his parents look very nervously at each other and say, well, about that, I know you asked us to bury him in the family plot, and he was like a brother to you, and he gave his life, but we had to bury him in the Negro cemetery because there's no way we can continue to do business in this town if we buried him in the white family plot. And he grows very sullen, this soldier, and then later that night goes to the victory parade and stands up and gives a speech and says, I'm ashamed of everything that I did in the war because of the way you behaved towards my friend who gave his life for the freedoms we all enjoy. So that alone is pretty heavy stuff for, a supposed kids medium. But just to illustrate that it wasn't just kids, there was a raging debate in the letters columns later that year, beginning with an airman who wrote in and said, "This is liberal propaganda. There's no way that the United States would let N-words in the same bunk as whites." And Feldstein or Gaines, whomever wrote the letters column, it was uncredited, said, "We're leaving this there just so you can see this is somebody in the U.S. Armed Forces." Well, over the months that followed, other people in the Armed Forces said, "Hey, this doesn't reflect us. That story reflects us, and that guy is a disgrace to the armed forces, and that guy is a disgrace to the flag." And then a month later, "Oh, I looked up that guy. He was dishonorably discharged." So there's evidence, both sales evidence and also this kind of anecdotal evidence that comics were being read by a wide range of readers. If you look at things like the Charles Byro Crime Does Not Pay comics, those are much closer in tone, subject matter, and execution to pulp magazines than they are to the superhero comics that, companies like DC were publishing. So, I think that while it was conceded the comics were largely read by kids, and certainly I think kids represented, possibly a majority of the readership, I don't think it represented the entire readership, and I think that we conceded as an industry that point to our own peril.
Mm-hmm. So the kinds of cases you're dealing with now, are these mostly like individuals making comics, or do publishers get in problems too, or what kind of situations are the problems coming up in?
We deal with two key areas when it comes to our casework. One is going to court, which thankfully we've been able to squash most of those cases before they've had to go to court recently. And those are always about the last point of distribution. So that's usually a retailer sells something that police object to on obscenity or harmful to minors grounds. Like I say, we haven't had one of those in a while, thank goodness. The other area is, and this is the more common one that we deal with several times a year, is people attempting to remove comics and graphic novels from schools and libraries on content areas. And we're not talking about outre content. We're talking about award-winning works like This One Summer by Jillian and Mariko Tamaki, or Drama by Raina Telgemeier, or Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. And so in those instances, we will do one of a variety of approaches. We'll either, counsel behind the scenes with the affected librarian or the affected teacher to help them manage the challenge. We'll provide them with research documents to help them defend the book, or we'll write letters of defense for the school boards advocating for that content. Because the thing that nobody really talks about when you talk about the challenges to any kind of a book in a library setting or a school setting is that there are two people that are affected most acutely. One is the professional who, using their professional judgment, is attempting to serve their community with valuable content that is being told that their professional judgment is an error and oftentimes being vilified in the media or being vilified in their local community for doing their job. And then the second is the person that actually is using and needs the content. And this is really tragic in the case of children. If you are a 11-year-old kid who is reading Drama by Raina Telgemeier, and you're looking at this as a book that reflects coming of age and your interests in theater and your interests in extracurricular activities, and you're told that there's something wrong with this book because it has a gay character, what kind of a lesson are you being taught? You're being taught that, there's something wrong with gay people. Or if you yourself are having feelings that you might be gay, then you're being told there's something wrong with you. And the discussion of, anybody can buy it on Amazon, that presumes that you have an economic ability to go out and pursue this material. And the purpose of the library, the purpose of the school library, is to provide access to information for the people that need it. So oftentimes the works that are being challenged are being taken away from some of the most vulnerable people in the community, and that's simply not right.
It sounds like the same kind of battles have been going on for decades with like Huckleberry Finn or Catcher in the Rye, same kind of problems. Okay. Now you gave me a couple of publications here. What are these?
CBLDF Defender, which is our quarterly news magazine. You can read it for free at cbldf.org. That one's our spring issue. That's the one I had to hand. The summer one is completely gone, actually. And then that's our annual report from last year, which we publish every November, just outlining the work that we've done in the prior year.
Okay, and then I understand you also publish an annual, it's like anthology of comics?
Yeah, we've done with Image for the last several years a annual anthology called the Liberty Annual. So that one, the last installment was published last year, and we're retooling it for 2018.
Okay, so it's not quite every year then.
Well, it's been annual for the last 8 or 9 years, but we put it on hiatus this year and are retooling it.
I see. Okay, and then that's sold in order to make money for the.
Yeah, that's right. Image Comics, in that case, offers the publication, which back installments are available either through your local retailer or through Comixology. And there's also a book collection of the first 5 years called CBODF Presents Liberty that's available. And that has contributions from Neil Gaiman and Robert Kirkman and Jill Thompson and just a tremendous amount of some of the greatest creators in the field.
Okay. Wow. So next one will be next year then. Okay. Great. So if people want to get involved in CBLDF, what should they do?
Please visit cbldf.org and subscribe to our free weekly email newsletter. If you're here in Portland and would like to volunteer at our office, you can help us out on our various program and fundraising operations. And the most important thing is, if you care about this kind of work, please become a member of CBLDF, which you can do at cbldf.org for as little as $5 a year. Your membership doesn't just raise money for our important work, it also provides the numbers so that when we do have to go after an unconstitutional law, we have the weight of our members who provide our standing in those cases to fight those bad laws.
Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, Twitter @deconcomics, like our Facebook page or join our Facebook discussion group. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on YouTube, on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com, and on comiccon.com, where our new episodes appear a few days before they show up anywhere else. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio. We really need more listeners to give us reviews and help us stand out from the many comics podcasts that are out there. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The most recent episode is right behind this one in our podcast feed. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Polls, we look at the first draft of Shoot a Crooked Arrow, featuring the Archer, and figure out what went wrong in Batman's Season 2 premiere. Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcast, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. In the past few weeks, we've heard from people I met in Columbus and Portland, and people Coombe met in the UK. Next week, we double back to where my trip started, in Minneapolis, where I met several members of the creators cooperative World Monster HQ. We'll hear from Peter Wortman, creator of the webcomic/graphic novel Over the Wall and its sequel, Stonebreaker. Loopy McGinty, creator of the webcomic Lollipoppet. And Sean Lynch, who's working on a graphic novel called The Zoo, a sci-fi fantasy story about whether we actually have the ability to choose. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.